On my 68th birthday, my son asked me not to come to his wedding. I'm Eleanor Grace, 68. And that was the moment I knew I had become invisible to the people I had once built my life around. Subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Thanks. It wasn't a loud moment. No screaming, no plates thrown. Just a message on my phone. The kind that starts polite and ends with a request that takes the air out of your lungs. He wrote that it would be easier if I didn't come, that with everything going on, my presence might complicate things. That was the word. Complicated. As though I were a problem to be solved. Not his mother. I sat alone at the kitchen table when I read it. The table where I'd fed him spoonfuls of soup when he was sick, where I'd iced his birthday cakes, with my clumsy, too thick frosting, where I'd waited up for him on those long teenage nights, listening for the sound of his key in the door. The message glowed on the cracked screen of my old phone, and the room felt too still, like the house itself was holding its breath. Outside the window, the garden was in bloom. The pink peonies had burst open that week, the same week every year, as if they were keeping some promise I had forgotten. I looked at them for a long while. The bees didn't care that I wasn't wanted. They went on with their work, dipping into the petals, legs heavy with pollen. I thought about calling him. I thought about demanding to know why. But instead, I set the phone down, and I folded the dish towel on my lap. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. I remember noticing how worn the linoleum was near the sink, where I'd stood thousands of times washing dishes, scrubbing potatoes, rinsing out little shirts stained with grass and mud. I stayed, like that, sitting, until the light began to change, and the shadows stretched long across the floor. The birthday card he'd sent, signed with both his and his fiancée's names, with no personal note, was still unopened on the counter. I hadn't wanted to read it before, and now I didn't have the heart to. Later, I made myself tea. The kettle whistled, sharp and bright, and I moved through the motions like a ghost in my own home. I thought of the dress I'd bought for the wedding, a pale blue one with soft lace at the sleeves. I'd spent an afternoon choosing it, wanting to look nice, wanting to fit in. It hung in the closet upstairs, tags still attached. I drank the tea standing at the window, watching the last of the sunlight disappear behind the neighbors' roofs. The street was quiet, no children playing, no cars passing. Just the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant bark of a dog. I didn't cry that night. I sat in my chair, the one by the window, and I let the darkness come. I let it wrap around the room, let it settle into the corners, let it fill up the space that used to be warm. And I thought of all the years between then and now, all the small moments that had led to this one. The first time he'd stayed away for Christmas, the calls that became fewer, the way his voice had grown formal, careful, as if speaking to a stranger. That night, I slept in a blue dress. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to feel, just for a moment, like I belonged somewhere, even if it was only in my own bed, in my own house, in my own quiet sorrow. The next morning, I woke up at dawn. The dress was wrinkled, and I felt foolish, but also free in a way I didn't expect. I folded it gently and placed it in the back of the wardrobe. I wouldn't return it. I wouldn't give it away. I would keep it, as a reminder not of his wedding, but of that night. The night I let go. The days after that message passed in a kind of muted blur. I kept to my routines, because that's what you do when your heart feels hollow. You hold on to the familiar. I rose early, as always, before the sun had fully lifted the shadows off the garden fence. I swept the porch. I made oatmeal. I fed the cat. These small tasks anchored me, though the ache in my chest pulsed steady beneath it all. When I think back when I let myself really remember, why, see all the ways I gave my life to them. My son, my late husband, even his parents, who never thought I was good enough. I see it in flashes, like photographs tucked in an old album, edges worn soft from years of turning the pages. I remember the winter of '88, when the flu swept through the house. My husband went to bed first, fevers and coughing. Our son was just 5 then, so small, his hair damp with sweat as I rocked him through the nights. I didn't sleep for days. I wiped their foreheads with cool cloths, spooned broth between their cracked lips, changed the sheets when they were too weak to move. I remember the smell of Vicks and boiled onions, the sting of worry behind my eyes. I stayed well, somehow, as mothers often do when they can't afford to fall. There was the time, years later, when he wrecked his first car. I was working part-time at the library then, trying to help with the bills. I got the call just before closing, a kind officer's voice, telling me he was all right, but shaken. The car was crumpled, he said. I left the books where they were, the cash drawer uncounted, and drove to the scene. His face was pale under the streetlights. I wrapped him in my coat. I remembered the way he leaned into me, like he was still my little boy. I said we'd figure it out, and we did. I took on extra hours, sold my mother's ring, we paid for the repairs, and I never mentioned the ring again. Birthdays, every year, without fail, I baked his favorite chocolate cake, the kind with the fudge frosting that took ages to get just right. I remember his face at 16, even at 26, lighting up when he saw it. I saved for those birthdays, pinched pennies where I could, so I could buy him something that would make him smile. A new baseball glove, a leather wallet, a warm coat for those Boston winters when he went off to school. Holidays, too. I made them beautiful, or tried to. I roasted turkeys, glazed hams, mashed potatoes with extra butter. I strung lights on the porch even when my fingers went numb from the cold. I stayed up late wrapping gifts so they'd look just right under the tree. I wrote cards in careful script, sealing each with a small pressed sprig of holly dot, and then there were the quieter things, the things no one saw. The nights I sat at the kitchen table balancing the checkbook, making sure we could cover the mortgage. In the mornings I rose before dawn to iron his shirts, so he'd look sharp at work. The calls I made to doctors, dentists, and teachers kept the machinery of our lives humming smoothly. The times I bit my tongue when the words I longed to say would have stirred trouble. When I smoothed over arguments, mended rifts, made peace where I could. I think of the year his father fell ill. How I drove him to every appointment, sat beside him through every chemo session, held his hand as his strength ebbed away. How I kept the house clean, the meals cooked, the laundry folded, so my son could focus on school, on work, on building his own life. I asked for nothing in return. I wanted him to be free to fly. There's a photograph in the drawer by my bed, a simple frame, tarnished at the corners. It's of the three of us on a beach in Maine. My husband, strong and tan, lifted our son onto his shoulders, and me, standing beside them, the wind tangling my hair, my hand reaching up as if to steady them both. That picture has traveled with me through every move, every change. It reminds me of the years I poured myself into their happiness. I suppose I thought those things would be remembered, that they would be enough. But memories, I've learned, can be fragile. They fade or get rewritten. People move on. They grow into versions of themselves that no longer need what you have to give, or they believe they don't. I tried not to dwell on it too much in those weeks after the message. I told myself he was busy, that weddings are stressful, that maybe I'd hear from him once the fuss had settled. But each day that passed without a word felt like a stone added to the weight in my chest. I kept busy. I tended the garden, pulling weeds, trimming back the roses. I baked bread, kneaded the dough, until my arms ached, the warm yeasty smell filling the house. I read old books, the ones I'd loved in girlhood, their pages soft from age. But always, beneath it all, that quiet ache remained. There were moments I'd catch myself listening to his voice. A car slowing outside would make my heart leap. The phone ringing would send a jolt of hope through me, only to find it was the pharmacy, or a wrong number. The house felt larger, emptier, as if it, too, were waiting. I thought of all the things I had done, and of how small they must have seemed in the end. How easy it must have been to let them slip from memory. I thought of my hands, these hands that had worked, soothed, mended, held, and I wondered when they had stopped being needed. I looked at them, at the veins rising under thin skin, at the faint scars from years of use, and I felt the sting of loss, deeper than I had expected. There is a kind of silence that settles after you have given all you can, and found it wasn't enough. It is not an angry silence, not at first. It is the silence of standing alone in a room once filled with voices, realizing those voices have moved on, leaving only echoes behind. And so, I waited. I waited for a sign, for a word, for anything that might bridge the widening gap between us. I waited, and as I did, I began to see things more clearly, the shape of our history, the pattern of giving and receiving that had, somehow, unraveled, and I began to understand that this was not the work of a single day or a single slight. It was the slow, steady drift of years. I did not know it then, but the waiting would not bring what I hoped for. What came instead was something far harder to bear, the realization that the distance between us was not an accident, but a choice. a choice I would soon see more clearly than I ever wished to. I began to notice the hurts after that, not the kind that comes all at once, like a door slammed in your face or a sharp word that leaves you reeling. These were smaller, quieter, like drops of water that, over time, wear down even the strongest stone. I suppose they had been there for years, but in those weeks, as I sat alone with my thoughts, they rose to the surface, one by one. It started with the calls that stopped coming. I used to hear from him every Sunday. A quick check-in at first, back when he was newly married, and I was careful not to overstep. I would ask about his work, his wife, and their plans. I kept my own answers short, so I wouldn't seem lonely, though I was. Then, slowly, the calls stretched further apart, every other week, then once a month. And then only when he needed something. A recipe, a document, the name of a childhood doctor. I would answer with a smile in my voice, pretending not to notice the gaps, pretending the silence between us wasn't growing wider. There were missed visits, to promises to stop by that melted away with the excuse of work or travel, or simply being too busy. I would dust the living room, set out fresh flowers, bake something warm, something that smelled like home, and I would wait, watching the road through the front window, listening for the sound of his car. But the hours would slip by, the sun would set, and I would gather up the flowers, wrap the cake, and put it all away as gently as I could. Birthdays and holidays became strained affairs. I would sit at the edge of gatherings, watching him laugh with others, my voice lost in the hum of conversation. He would hug me hello, distracted, his eyes already scanning the room for someone else. There was a Christmas where I gave him a scarf I had knitted, navy blue, soft wool, the kind I knew would keep him warm in the Boston cold. He thanked me, politely, and left it behind on the chair when they went. I found it later, folded just as I had wrapped it, untouched. And there were the little corrections, the small ways he let me know I no longer quite fit in his world. The time I brought a pie to their housewarming, and he said, too lightly, that they preferred to buy dessert from the bakery now. The time I offered to babysit my granddaughter, he said they had a sitter they trusted. The way he gently steered me away from conversations at gatherings, as if my opinions were relics from another time, no longer useful or welcome. I began to feel it in how others treated me, too. Friends of his who barely met my eyes, his wife's family, kind on the surface, but always keeping a certain distance, as if I might say or do something embarrassing. And I began to shrink, to speak less, to make myself small so I wouldn't be in the way. I became, I suppose, what they seemed to want me to be, a quiet figure at the edge of their lives. There but not seen. That the house grew quieter too. The garden, once a place of joy, felt like a reminder of how much I tended to things that no one noticed. I planted bulbs in the fall, hoping for spring color, but by the time the flowers bloomed, no one came to see them. The roses climbed the trellis, the peonies burst open, and I admired them alone. I took photographs, at first, thinking to send them, but the pictures stayed on my phone, unsent. I imagined him glancing at them, polite but disinterested, and I saved us both the effort. There was one day, one of many that stayed with me. I had gone into town for groceries. It was a small thing, a trip I'd made countless times, but that day the weight of it felt heavier. I passed a cafe where we had once sat together, sharing coffee and a slice of cake, talking easily about nothing and everything. The table by the window was empty. I stood outside for a moment, watching the people inside, and I felt the sharp sting of being forgotten. I walked on, the bag heavy in my hand, the ache deeper than I could name, and through it all, I kept hoping for a call, a visit, a sign that I still mattered. But hope, when stretched too thin, frays at the edges. Each small hurt added to the fraying. A birthday card that arrived late, signed without a note. A holiday invitation that never came. A family photograph posted online, where I had been cropped out or never included at all. A mention of a gathering I hadn't known about, spoken as if I should have. It was not cruelty, I want to be clear about that. There were no harsh words, no deliberate wounds, just absence, just the slow, steady pulling away, so quiet that for a long time I told myself it wasn't happening, that I was imagining it, that if I tried a little harder, was a little kinder, a little more patient, things would return to what they had been, but they did not. And in that slow fading, I began to lose pieces of myself. I stopped baking as much. The flour sat in its tin, untouched. I stopped tending the garden with the same care. Weeds crept in at the edges. The radio stayed off. The books on my bedside table gathered dust. The house, once warm and full of small joys, became a place I moved through quietly, careful not to disturb the stillness. I kept a smile ready, for the neighbors, for the postman, for anyone who might look my way. But inside, I felt like a ghost, moving through the motions of a life that no longer quite felt like mine. I waited for the moments that would anchor me again, that would remind me of who I had been, but they did not come. Or if they did, they passed so quickly that I barely had time to grasp them before they were gone. And through it all, I carried the weight of those 100 quiet hurts, not loud enough to break me all at once, but enough to hollow me out bit by bit, enough to leave me standing at the window on quiet evenings, watching the world go on without me. I did not yet know what final hurt would tip the balance, but I felt it coming, like the change in the air before a storm. I felt it in the silences, in the spaces where love had once lived, now empty. I felt it in the way I had begun to brace myself for the next small wound, the next quiet erasure, and I wondered, not for the first time, how much more of myself I could give before there was nothing left at all. It is strange how the deepest betrayals don't always announce themselves. You don't always see them coming with fanfare or fury. Sometimes they slip in quietly, like a draft through a cracked window, cold against your neck, leaving you shivering before you even realize what's happened. That was how it was for me. In the end, I had been living in that house, our house, for over 40 years. The walls held every version of me, the young bride unpacking dishes in the kitchen, the mother rocking a fevered child through long nights, the widow folding clean sheets in the laundry room, trying to stay upright in the quiet that followed. That house had been my anchor, my comfort, my small piece of certainty in a world that seemed, more and more, to have no place for me. I didn't have much in the way of wealth. What I had was that home, paid for over decades of careful budgeting, of saying no to luxuries so we could make the mortgage, keep the roof solid, the heat on. I had refinished floors with my own hands, painted the porch railings, and planted trees that now shaded the yard. That house was more than wood and brick to me. It was a memory made solid. It was everything I had left to pass on. And so, when the letter arrived, I didn't understand at first. A thick envelope, official looking, with my name printed neatly on the front. Inside, documents full of language I didn't at once comprehend, legal terms, signatures, dates. I read it 3 times before the meaning sank in. My son had sold the house, or rather, he had arranged it so that it no longer belonged to me. I don't know when he began the process, or how he managed it without my knowledge. What I do know is that the papers bore my signature, or what appeared to be my signature, but I had not signed. I had not agreed. I had not known. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had fed him as a boy, and I turned those pages over in my hands. My fingers trembled, the paper soft with the pressure of my grip. I tried to make sense of it, to tell myself there must be some mistake. But there was no mistake. It was all there in black and white, the careful work of someone who had planned well. Planned, I realized, to erase me even from this last place I called my own. It was not about money, not really. The price was fair, the transaction clean on the surface. No, it was about what that act said. About how little I now mattered in the story of his life, how easy it had become to set me aside, to trade the place where I had built our family for something newer, something neater, something free of the reminders of where he had come from. I thought of every window I had washed, every meal cooked in that kitchen, every hour spent tending the garden he no longer saw. I thought of my husband, of how we had dreamed together in that house, imagined growing old there, imagined passing it on to the son we loved. And I thought of how, in the end, none of that had been enough to bind him to it or to me. The worst of it was that he hadn't told me. Not a word, not a conversation, not a warning, not even a cold, hard explanation. Just papers in the mail, as if I were a tenant being informed of some change beyond my control, as if I were no one at all. I sat for a long time that afternoon, the light shifting across the floor, the sounds of the neighborhood moving past the windows, children calling to one another, a dog barking, a lawnmower starting up down the block, the ordinary sounds of life continuing as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In the space of a few pieces of paper, everything I had held on to was gone. I don't remember making tea, but I must have, because at some point I found myself holding a cup, the steam curling up into the still air. I watched it rise and disappear, and I thought of how easily things can vanish when you're not watching closely enough. That evening, I walked the rooms of the house slowly. I touched the door frames, ran my hand along the banister, stood for a while in the doorway of what had been my son's room. The wallpaper was faded now, the colors soft from age, but I could still see the outlines where his posters had once hung. I remembered tucking him in there, the way he had once reached for my hand in the dark, the way I had promised, in that quiet voice of mothers everywhere, that I would always keep him safe. I suppose I believed that promise extended both ways, that he would keep me safe, too, in whatever ways he could, that he would honor the years I had given him, the love I had wrapped around him like a second skin. But life, I have learned, is not always so tidy. Love is not always returned in the shape it is given. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house, the familiar sounds that had comforted me once, and now seemed to echo with loss. I thought of calling him, of demanding answers, but I knew, deep down, that the answers would not change what had been done, and I was too tired, too hollow, to spend my last reserves of strength on a conversation that would only leave me more empty. Instead, I rose with the dawn. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with a pad of paper and a pen, and I began to make a list. Not a list of grievances, though. I could have filled pages with those, but a list of what I needed to do next. Practical things, necessary things, because once the final line is crossed, there is no going back. There is only forward. I would find out my rights. I would speak to someone who could help me understand the tangle of papers that had arrived. I would, somehow, reclaim what I could, or, at the very least, find a way to step beyond the wreckage with dignity and tact. But most of all, I would begin, at last, to let go of the hope that had kept me tethered, the hope that he would see me, hear me, choose me, the hope that what I had given would be enough to matter. I would let it go, because hope, when misplaced, can become a kind of poison, and I had swallowed enough of that to last a lifetime. That morning, as the sun rose higher and the house filled with light, I felt something I had not expected, not rage, not sorrow, though that lingered still. I felt resolved, quiet, steady, born not of anger but of clarity, the clarity that comes when there is nothing left to lose and nothing left to wait for. And so, I began, not with grand gestures or bold declarations, but with small steps, a phone call, a question asked, a truth faced. I began, not because I wanted to, but because I had to, because the final line had been crossed, and the only way forward was through. After that morning, I found that I had little left to say, not to him, not to anyone. The words that had once filled my days, the gentle reminders, the questions, the small offerings of connection seemed to wither in my throat. What was there to speak, after all? What could be said that would unmake what had been done? I went about my days with a kind of quiet precision. I kept the house in order, though it no longer felt like mine. I swept the floors, dusted the shelves, watered the plants. Each task gave my hands something to do, though my heart was elsewhere. I moved through the rooms like a guest in a place I used to know, careful not to disturb the memories that clung to the walls. I stopped calling, stopped writing. There had been a time when I would leave voicemails, small messages of love or news, hoping for a reply, when I would send cards on holidays, little notes tucked inside, reminders that I was here, that I cared. But those calls, those cards, had gone unanswered too often. The silence that came back to me had grown heavier than the words I sent out. And so I stopped, not out of anger, but out of understanding. Understanding that my voice was no longer needed in their world, that it only served to remind them of a connection they had already chosen to loosen. I spoke to a lawyer, a kind man, gray-haired and patient, who listened without judgment as I laid out the papers, the story. He explained what had been done, what could and could not be undone. He helped me take the first steps toward untangling the mess, though even he could not untangle the ache beneath it all. I left his office with a folder of documents and a quiet determination I had not felt in years. In the evenings, I would sit on the back porch, a blanket over my knees, watching the sky darken. The stars would come out, one by one, and I would sit until the chill crept into my bones, until the quiet of the night wrapped itself around me. Those hours became a kind of comfort, a space where no words were needed, where no explanations were expected. The world went on without me, and I let it. I let the silence settle, and I found that it did not frighten me as I thought it might. There was a strange peace in it, a peace born of knowing that I no longer had to try. I began to see the truth of things in that silence. I saw how long I had clung to hope, how often I had excused the small slights, the missed calls, the forgotten days, how I had told myself stories to fill the gaps, to soften the blows. In the quiet, there were no more stories, only what was, and what was, I saw clearly now, was that I had been holding on to an image of family that no longer existed. I kept to myself. The neighbors noticed, I suppose. They would wave when they saw me at the mailbox, or offer a kind word as I passed. On my walks, I would smile, nod, and exchange pleasantries. But I did not seek out conversation. The words felt too heavy, and I had so few left to give. I began to save what I could, not just money, though I did that too carefully with every dollar, setting aside what I might need for the battles ahead, but I also saved my energy, my attention, my care. I had spent so much of myself on those who no longer wanted it, and now, I kept those pieces close. I gave what little I had left to the small things that remained, the garden, the cat, the quiet of the early mornings. I found a kind of strength in that, a strength I had not known I possessed. I learned things, too, things I might have wished not to know, but that came to me all the same. The lawyer uncovered details, records, and truths that had been hidden. I saw how carefully the plan had been laid, how deliberately the steps had been taken. It was not a mistake, not an accident. It was a choice. That was the hardest part, I think, to see it laid out so plainly, to see how little I had figured into their vision of the future. And so I withdrew. I did not rage, I did not plead, I did not explain. I let the silence speak for me. I let it say what my words no longer could, that I was done reaching for what would not be returned, that I was done offering myself up only to be refused. In that silence, I began to plan. Small plans at first, practical things, where I might go, what I might do, how I might build a life that was mine alone, free of the weight of waiting for love that would not come. I did not share these plans. They were mine, and mine alone. A quiet rebellion, perhaps, or simply a way to steady myself for whatever came. Next, I wrote no letters, burned no bridges. I simply stepped back, one day at a time, until the distance between us matched the distance that had long existed in our hearts. It was not easy. There were nights when the loneliness felt sharp enough to cut, mornings when I reached for the phone out of habit, only to draw my hand back. But with each passing day, the habit faded, the ache dulled, and the silence became not an absence, but a presence of its own, a presence that held me, steady and sure, when nothing else did. I stopped looking for signs, stopped hoping for calls that would not come. I let the days unfold as they would, without expectation, without longing, and in that letting go, I found a kind of freedom, a freedom I had not sought, but that came all the same. I began to see myself not as what I had lost, but as what remained, a woman who had given all she could, and who now stood quietly in the aftermath, not broken, but changed, a woman who had learned, at last, that sometimes silence is not emptiness. Sometimes it is the space where strength begins to grow. And so I went silent, and in that silence, I began, slowly, to find my way forward. After I went silent, something inside me shifted. It didn't happen all at once. There was no grand awakening, no dramatic turning point. It was slower than that, like the gradual way dawn light creeps across the floorboards of a room you thought was dark. I began to move differently, not with the rush of anger or the heaviness of sorrow, but with a quiet purpose I had not known I was capable of. It started with small things. I cleared out the closets, not in a frantic, emotional sweep, but carefully, thoughtfully. I touched each item, each relic of a life I had built, and I asked myself whether it still served me. The coats that no longer fit, the dishes for dinners that would not be shared, the stacks of photo albums that no one came to look through. I kept what mattered to me and let the rest go. The local charity shop grew to know my face. I kept the deeds I needed, the certificates, the documents that marked the path of my life, but the rest, the notes from long-forgotten meetings, the faded receipts for things that no longer existed, die burned. In the small metal bin behind the house, I fed those papers to the flames, and I watched the smoke rise into the quiet sky. It felt, in some small way, like reclaiming myself. The house, once heavy with memory, began to feel lighter. I opened the windows more, let the breeze carry away the dust of old sorrows. I moved the furniture, not for anyone else's comfort, but for my own. I made space in the rooms where once I had felt crowded by absence. I planted new flowers in the garden, not the kind that had been favorites of my son or my husband, but the ones that pleased me. The soft blues and purples I had always admired in other people's yards, but never allowed myself to choose. And, when they bloomed, I admired them quietly, just for me. There was a day, not long after, when I walked to the small park at the edge of town. I had not been there in years. The path was lined with oaks, their leaves just beginning to turn, and I felt the crispness of autumn in the air. I sat on a bench, the same one where I had once sat with my husband, watching our boy play on the swings, and I let myself sit there, alone, without sadness. The wind lifted my hair, and I felt, for the first time in a long while, that I belonged to myself. I began to take more walks. Early in the morning, before the streets grew busy, I would walk the length of the town, past the shops opening their shutters, past the school where I had once waited in the carpool line, past the cafe I no longer entered. I walked not to arrive anywhere, but simply to move, to remind myself that I was still here, that I was still whole, in my own quiet way. I met with the lawyer again. We spoke plainly about what had been done, about what could be done in return. He offered paths forward, some that might bring restitution, some that might bring only further struggle. I listened, I considered, and I chose carefully. I chose the path that would allow me to step free without more fighting, without more noise. I did not want to win anything from them. I only wanted to be done. And so, piece by piece, I untangled myself from what they had made. I sold what was left of value, not out of bitterness, but out of necessity. I found a small cottage on the edge of town, nothing grand, but enough. Enough space for my books, my chair by the window, my little garden, enough space for peace. Moving day came quietly. I packed my few things, the things that mattered, into boxes I labeled in careful script. The movers were kind young men who worked quickly, and I watched as the house emptied. Room by room, it became only a house again, not my home. When they were done, I stood in the doorway one last time, my hand resting on the frame, and I thanked the house in my heart for all it had given me. And then I left, that the new cottage welcomed me like a warm hand on my shoulder. The first night, I slept with the windows open, listening to the crickets, to the rustling of leaves. I felt no sorrow, only relief. Relief to have stepped beyond the weight of what had been. Relief to begin again, in a place that held no ghosts. In the weeks that followed, I built a new rhythm. I rose with the sun, drank my coffee on the porch, and watched the day unfold. I planted herbs in pots by the kitchen door. I joined the library again, and on rainy afternoons I would sit by the window and lose myself in stories that had nothing to do with my own. I learned to cook small meals, just for one, and I found that I did not mind it. The silence that had once felt like emptiness now felt like space. Space to breathe, space to be. I did not shut the world out entirely. I spoke to neighbors, gentle greetings at first that grew into small conversations. I went to the market, exchanged smiles with the woman who sold flowers, and with the man who ran the bakery. But I no longer reached beyond what felt right. I no longer gave pieces of myself to those who would not treasure them. I moved differently, not because I had become hard or bitter, but because I had learned. I learned that love, to be true, must be met. That giving, to be worthy, must be received with care. I had given all I could, and now I gave to myself. There were days when the ache of what I had lost would rise, unbidden, when a memory would catch me off guard, soft as a sigh, sharp as a blade. I let those moments come. I did not fight them, but I did not let them rule me. They were part of my story, yes, but not the whole of it. And so I moved differently, with care, with intention, with a quiet strength I had not known I carried. I walked the new path I had chosen, and with each step I felt lighter, freer, more myself than I had been in years. What they had taken no longer defined me. What I built in its place became my truth, and that, I found, was enough. I did not disappear from the world, though I suppose to them it might have seemed that way. I stepped quietly out of their orbit, let their lives spin on without the gravity of my presence. There was no announcement, no final word, no scene, just the soft closing of a door, the gentle turning of a key, and the sound of my footsteps walking away. At first, I wondered if they noticed, if they felt the absence as keenly as I felt the absence of their love. I imagined them at gatherings, my chair empty at the table, my name left unspoken. I imagined them moving through holidays, through milestones, through ordinary days, and I wondered if, in the quiet moments between, they thought of me. But I did not dwell on it for long. I had spent too many years thinking of them, waiting on them, shaping my world around their needs and wants. Now, I shaped my world around myself. But as time passed, word reached me, as it always does in small towns. Through whispers and glances, through the subtle ways people signal what they know, I heard that things were not as smooth for them as they once had been. That the house that had been mine, did not bring them the peace or the prosperity they might have hoped for. The new owners, I was told, were quick to change things, to tear down what I had built with care. The garden went wild, the paint peeled, the roof leaked in the spring rains. It was just a house to them. And houses, I suppose, can sense when they are no longer loved. Their own home, I heard, was not as warm as they had imagined it would be. Without the steady hand that had once smoothed tensions, without the quiet presence that had once filled the empty spaces, small cracks widened, the gatherings grew fewer, the laughter thinner. I did not rejoice in this. I felt no triumph in their loss. But I saw, from a distance, the shape of what I had given, now gone. There were practical losses to the small help I had offered without fanfare, the errands run, the tasks tended, the gifts given without occasion, the warmth of a meal brought when days were long, the comfort of knowing someone was near who cared, truly cared. They had not seen these things as gifts while they had them. They had seen them as givens, as the natural order of things. And when they were no longer there, I think they felt the chill of that absence. I did not watch closely. I did not linger on their doorstep or ask after them directly. But the shape of their lives reached me in small ways. I heard of the strained conversations, the invitations that grew more formal, more forced, the way they began to lean on others, friends or neighbors, to fill the gaps where once I had been. And I knew, as surely as I knew my own name, that what they leaned on now could not bear the weight as I had. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out, to offer again what had been refused. But I did not out of pride, but out of wisdom hard-earned. I had learned, at last, that love must be met where it is given. That to give endlessly to those who will not receive is to pour oneself into a cup with no bottom. And I was done. Being emptied, I watched, too, as they lost, not just me, but the quiet strength of what I had been in their lives, the keeper of stories, the holder of memories, the gentle thread that had tied past to present. Without that thread, the fabric of the family began to fray. Birthdays forgotten, anniversaries marked without the cards, the cakes, the small remembrances that I had once provided. The glue that had held them together softened, dissolved, and the pieces began to drift apart. It is not that they had no one. There were others, of course, friends, colleagues, in-laws, but none who knew them as I had. None who saw the child in the man, the boy who once clutched my hand in the dark, the young husband who had once leaned on my steady love. None who held their history in their heart, as I had done. I heard, once, that they tried to recreate what had been lost. They hosted a holiday dinner, hoping to build new traditions, but the table felt emptier, despite the number of guests. The food, though plentiful, lacked the taste of memory. The decorations, though bright, did not warm the room as mine had. And so the evening ended early, the guests departing with polite smiles, the house quiet once again. There was no malice in my heart as I heard these things, only a deep, steady sadness, the kind that comes from knowing what could have been, what had been, and what would not be again. I had given all I could, and in stepping away, I had shown them, without words, what that giving had meant. I do not know if they ever truly saw it, if they looked back and understood what they had lost. Some part of me hopes they did. Some part of me hopes that, in their own quiet moments, they felt the shape of my absence and honored it. But if they did not, that is theirs to carry, not mine. I had my own life to tend to, my own peace to nurture. And so I let them go, fully, and without regret. I let them walk their path, as I walked mine. And in the space where sorrow might have lingered, I planted new joys, small, quiet joys that belonged to me alone. A cup of tea on a rainy afternoon, a walk through the woods, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, the bloom of my lavender in the spring, the soft hum of bees among the blossoms, the laughter of a neighbor's child, carried on the breeze. These became my treasures. These became what filled the spaces they had left behind. And in that, I found something I had not expected. I found that what they lost without me was not my concern. I had had enough. I had given enough. And in stepping away, I had given myself back to myself. That, I realized, was the greatest gift of all. It happened on an ordinary morning. The kind of morning that slips past without ceremony or notice. The air was cool, touched by the promise of autumn. And I had risen early, as I often did, to sit by the window with my coffee and watch the first light stretch across the fields beyond my little cottage. There was a hush to the world then, a stillness I had come to cherish. It was in those quiet hours that I felt most at peace, as if the world and I had reached an understanding. I don't know what moved me to do it. Perhaps it was the softness of the light, or the way the breeze stirred the curtain, or the simple truth that I had carried too much for too long. But that morning, I reached for a sheet of paper, for a pen that had not seen my hand in many months, and I began to write. It was not planned. There was no outline in my mind, no intention beyond the need to let the words flow at last. The pen moved as if guided by something deeper than thought, and I let it. I let the ink mark the page, let the truth spill out in the soft rhythm of my hand. I wrote not to my son, though his shadow surely hovered over the page. I wrote to myself, to the woman I had been, to the girl I had once been, to the version of me who had given and waited for that giving to be seen. The letter began simply, "You have done enough." 3 small words, but as I wrote them, I felt their weight settle into me, like a balm on an old wound. I wrote of the years of care, of the nights spent at sickbeds, of the meals prepared, the birthdays marked, the small joys tended. I wrote of the silent hurts, the ones I had never spoken aloud, the ones that had carved quiet hollows in my heart. I wrote of the hopes I had carried like fragile glass, and how they had slipped from my grasp, one by one. I did not write with bitterness. I did not write to accuse. The letter was not a ledger of wrongs or a list of grievances. It was a release, a way of setting down what no longer needed to be carried. I wrote of love, the love that had shaped me, the love that had sustained me, the love that, in the end, had asked more of me than it had returned. And I wrote of forgiveness, not for them, but for myself, for the ways I had lost myself in the trying, for the ways I had mistaken silence for strength, giving for worth. I wrote for hours, the coffee growing cold at my side, the sun climbing higher, casting patterns of light and shadow on the table. I wrote until my hand ached, until the page was full, until there was nothing left to say. And when I was done, I set the pen down, and I read the words back to myself, quietly, as if offering them to the morning. The letter was not long, but it held everything I needed it to. I folded it gently, the way one folds a cherished piece of cloth, and I placed it in an envelope. I did not address it. There was no need. It was not meant to be sent. It was meant to be freed. That afternoon, I walked to the edge of the woods behind the cottage. The path was soft with fallen leaves, and the air smelled of pine and earth. I found a clearing where the sun broke through the branches, warm and golden. And there, I knelt, and I lit a small fire. Not large, not fierce, just enough to catch the edge of the paper, to watch the flames curl the corners, to see the words lift in smoke and ash into the sky. I watched until the last ember faded, until the letter was nothing but a memory, carried on the breeze. And I felt, as I stood and brushed the leaves from my skirt, a lightness I had not known in years. As if in burning those words, I had burned away the last of the weight I had borne, as if I had, at last, made peace with all that had been. The days that followed were quieter still, but the quiet no longer felt like absence. It felt like space. Space to breathe, to be, to begin again. I found myself smiling more, not at anyone in particular, but at the world itself, the way the sunlight caught on a spider's web, the way the wind played with the grass, the way the stars blinked awake in the night sky. The letter changed me, because it allowed me to see myself as I was, as I am, not as a mother left behind, not as a wife long widowed, not as a woman defined by what she had lost, but as a soul who had given fully, who had loved deeply, who had walked through sorrow and come out, not unscathed, but unbroken, and in that knowing, I found a kind of freedom. A freedom that asked nothing of anyone else. A freedom that was mine, alone. I kept no copy of the letter. I needed none. The words were no longer on the page, they were in me, woven into the fabric of who I had become. And they guided me, softly, as I stepped into each new day. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch, the same chair, the same blanket, but with a heart less heavy. I would watch the night come on, the stars take their places, and I would feel no longing for what had been, only gratitude for what remained. And that, I understood at last, was enough. My life is quiet now, not the quiet of emptiness, not the kind of hush that presses heavy on the heart. It is the quiet of peace, of steady days and soft evenings, of a rhythm that belongs only to me. The cottage, small and unassuming, has become a sanctuary. The walls hold no tension, no unspoken hurt. The air is easy to breathe. The floors creak beneath my steps in a way that feels like a greeting, not a complaint. I have learned the language of this place, and it has learned mine. Each morning I rise before the sun crests the horizon. The world at that hour feels untouched, as if it's waiting to begin again. I step out onto the porch with my coffee, warm in my hands, and I watch as the light spills slowly over the fields and woods. The birds are my companions now. Their songs fill the dawn, and I listen, content, as they go about their business. There is no rush in these hours, no demands beyond what I choose for myself. I sip the coffee slowly, feeling the steam on my face, and I think of nothing at all, or everything. The line between the two has blurred in these quiet days. I tend my little garden with care, though not with the urgency I once did. The lavender, the rosemary, the wildflowers I scattered in spring all grow as they will, and I do not fight their wildness. I have come to see the beauty in things that do not follow the lines we set for them. I pull weeds where they threaten the balance, but I no longer feel the need to control every corner. The bees and the butterflies visit freely, and I let them. I have become, in a way, just another creature in this small patch of world. No longer the keeper of others' comfort, no longer the mender of what was broken in someone else's life. Simply here, simply me. The days pass gently. I walk the same paths through the woods, and yet they are never the same. The trees shift. With the seasons, the light falls differently as the months turn. I notice these changes now, in ways I once would have missed. The softness of moss beneath my feet, the way a single leaf catches the sunlight just so, the sudden burst of color, where a wildflower has taken root in rocky soil. These small wonders fill the spaces where sorrow once lingered, and they are enough. I read, too, in the afternoons when the light pours through the windows just right. Old books, mostly the kind that smell of paper and time, the kind whose pages I've turned so often that they fall open to the parts I love best. I lose myself in those stories, in the worlds they offer, and I do not feel lonely there. The characters, the words, the quiet, they are company of a kind that asks nothing of me but presence. Sometimes I write, not long letters, not the outpourings of hurt I once imagined I might send, but small thoughts, captured on scraps of paper. A description of the way the rain sounded on the roof last night. A memory of my mother's hands, gentle on my brow, when I was small. A line of poetry that rises in me unbidden. I tuck these notes into a jar by the window, letting them gather like fallen leaves, beautiful in their time. There are visitors, from time to time. A neighbor with a basket of apples, a child who comes to ask about the herbs growing by the fence, the postman with a kind word as he hands over a letter or a parcel. I welcome them, share what I have, and let them go with ease. I do not cling, do not seek to draw them close beyond what is natural. The connections I have now are gentle, unburdened by expectation. And that, I have learned, is its own kind of love. I think of my son less often now. When his name comes to mind, it is without the sharpness it once carried. There is no bitterness in me, no desire to reopen the wound. Only a soft sorrow, like a scar beneath the skin, is felt when the weather changes. I hope he is well. I hope, in his own way, he has found peace. But I do not wait for him. I do not look to the road, listening for the sound of his car. That part of my life has closed, and I have learned to let it rest. Evenings are my favorite time. I sit on the porch, wrapped in a shawl, and I watch as the day fades. The sky turns to gold, then rises, then deep indigo, the stars pricking through one by one. I listen to the night creatures stir, to the wind, in the trees, to the soft hush that settles over everything. And in those moments, I feel complete. Not because my life is full of grand things, it is not, but because it is mine. Because it is quiet, and it is honest, and it asks nothing more of me than I am willing to give. I have no riches, no great accomplishments to point to, but I have this, a small life, tended with care, a soul that has learned to be at ease with itself, a heart that, though marked by sorrow, beats steady and sure. I am not angry, I am not waiting, I am simply here, in this place, in this moment, and that is enough. There are those who might look at my life and see emptiness, a cottage at the edge of town, no family gathered close, no great noise or bustle, but they would be wrong. My life is rich in ways that cannot be measured by what has been lost. It is rich in the softness of mornings, in the gold of late light, in the quiet joy of tending what is mine. It is rich in the freedom to choose, each day, how I will spend my hours, my thoughts, my love. And so, my life is quiet now. And that's enough. I wasn't angry. I was finally empty, and that was beautiful.